Launch into my talk, and I think the actual title of the talk was something different, and that's the prerogative of the directors to be able to change the talk over the course of a couple days when I put the presentation together. But I wanted to call this Getting Back on the Radar. And I think we've heard a lot in this conference about emerging trends, where the field is, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Typically, this position or speaking slot in the end of a conference, the person gets up here and kind of tells you what you heard for 3 days. And you all here. You don't need me to get up here and tell you what you heard. What I'd like to do instead is to kind of summarize where I think we are and where we need to go, and put a challenge out to all of you to leave this meeting energized to do some of the things we need to do to push the field forward. And so with that, I'd like to kind of go to the first slide. All right, how many people out there recognize this picture? Yes, right? Cecil the Lion, right? So the reason I have Cecil the Lion up here is I think it's a good illustration of how the power of the internet and how social media can really set the agenda for a certain issue. Last Friday, I was going through Yahoo, my news feed, and I saw a bunch of stories on this, and I Googled Cecil the Lion. 37 million hits, or Google hits in 1 week, 37 million hits. All right, so just think about that for a minute. Caused big outrage. We had protests all over the country. We've had editorials, we've had news stories, we've had all kinds of things happen in a week on this issue. And certainly it's a worthy issue, right? It's who could not feel bad about this? Who could not say that that was a tragic and senseless death of an animal? But to have that kind of action and that kind of momentum in social media for this issue really kind of hit home to me of where our field is in relation to some of the other issues that we compete with in the 24/7 news cycle that we live in these days. So I want to come back to Cecil in a little bit, but I want to move forward and talk a little bit about our field and where we are in kind of the social media world right now. So we've all heard the statistic at this point, and you heard a bunch of statistics throughout the conference. 4% of all college students at minimum, and that's probably a conservative estimate, are in recovery or need recovery support services. 1,800 college students die every year due to alcohol-related causes. College is the time when most people who start misusing prescription drugs start misusing prescription drugs. So we have major issues. Sexual assault on campus, we heard from our last speaker. The emerging marijuana issue. So this is in the media occasionally. And we see cycles. I've been in this field 20 years, and it ebbs and flows. But in the kind of history of everything, I don't ever remember a time where we've got the type of attention that we had just last week for the Cecil incident. So let's dig a little deeper into some of the alcohol-related issues on college campuses. That number, does anyone want to guess what that number is? It's a little obscure. That is the number of drinking events that end in intoxication for college students in America every year. That's how many times people get drunk. And that's a conservative estimate, right? We go back to that 1,800 students who die each year due to alcohol-related causes. I did a little quick math. If we took a moment of silence for each one of those students who died, the whole agenda of this meeting would have been in silence. All 3 10-hour days would have been completely in silence. Big issue, right? The amount of risk for that number is staggering. If you think about everything else we've talked about, all right? The kinds of problems that go into this, and I could go on and on with statistics. The almost 800,000 alcohol-related injuries every year. academic failure, and so on and so on. But my point is, it's a huge issue, and it's an issue that's been around a long time. I've been giving this talk about the history of college alcohol problems, and one of the slides I always like to throw up is the first college-related alcohol-fueled riot was in 1350 BC, or not BC, I'm sorry, 1350. BC, it would really be a long problem. But 660 years ago was the first college alcohol problem, right? Documented. So it's an old problem. It's been around as long as colleges have been around. So what do you think happened when I Googled college alcohol death? I got 40 million hits, all right? So this issue's been around in the media for the whole history of the internet, all right? And in 1 week, the Cecil story caught up with our whole field. 1 week. That tells me we have a problem. We have a problem. We need to do something to get back on the radar. And I want to talk a little bit about, I'm looking at this problem kind of like Peter Lake was. He mentioned some folks that I'm sure a lot of the people in this room don't know the names of the folks he mentioned, but there's been a handful of people working on this issue for 20, 25 years, and we've kind of seen what's happened, and I'll argue now that the field's at a critical transition point, and it's one that we have to take the right steps, or we're going to end up in some even more serious problems than we've had in the past. So this is kind of what I came to, and this comes from a lot of my own personal experience. We're not really an issue that's on the radar for a lot of politicians, for a lot of college presidents, for a lot of the community, okay? So we need to do a better job of telling our story. Now, that's not all bad news, because actually the field is at a point where we know more now than we've ever known about what's effective, all right? We have a body of literature. When I first came into this field, we didn't know what worked. And the government spent a lot of money trying to fund research studies that would show what works. And we really kind of know for a lot of things what works, especially for alcohol. We still have to fund research and recovery and find out what best practices in recovery are. We certainly, as we heard in marijuana, it's the Wild West of marijuana research, and no pun intended. So there's still research to be done, but around the alcohol issue, we have a pretty good idea of what works. That said, there is still a massive gap between what happens in the practice world and what happens in the research world. And that's really the gap that the higher ed center is hoping to close, okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second and why that is. But I want to give you one statistic. NIAAA in 2000 went out and they spent several $1 million on what was called the tier system. How many of you are familiar with the tier system? So about maybe a quarter of the people put their hands up. The tier system was basically a system to classify what best practices were around alcohol prevention on college campuses. They had a blue panel research committee. They published a special issue of the Journal of Studies on Alcohol. They put up a website. They had an initiative for college presidents. A ton of media. They built a big website. 10 years later, a group of researchers, a colleague of mine, Tobin Nelson, did a study to see what the impact of that was, and basically found that only half of the campuses in the country that he surveyed had done anything that was evidence-based. 1 out of 5 didn't even know the report existed, okay? So they didn't even know that NIAAA had done this. So we failed, and I'm saying we as a researcher, we have failed in getting research into the real world. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the reasons for that is that researchers don't have the on-the-ground experience that most of the people in this room have. And I think the Higher Ed Center presents a wonderful opportunity to take your wisdom of what can work in the real world and what we know from science and figure out where the two can meet in a way that's practical. And so that's something that I'm going to make a commitment to in the next year, to really trying to close that gap through practice communities where we link researchers and practitioners, and we start having honest conversations about what would really work in a real world. And there's going to be some challenges to that as well, both political challenges and training challenges. But there's also going to be some fiscal challenges. We need more money to do what we need to do. And when I say that, I mean all of us. We all are probably grossly underfunded for what we're trying to do. We just did a study. We did about 200 college campuses, and I thank some of you in this room, filled out our survey, where we asked everybody about what you did on college campuses, what your practices were, what kind of programs. And then we wanted to know what your annual budget was, okay? And the thing that was striking to me and scary is that over 40% of our 200 respondents basically told us they have less than $5,000 a year to spend on prevention and recovery programming on their campus, okay? Now, I know for a fact that even the poorest universities could put more money in than that, all right? So again, this to me is an indicator that we're not telling our story in a way that's motivating the people who can sign a check on our campus to sign the check to let us do what we need to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So we're at this point in time where we know more about what works, we know more about what to do, we know more about the approach we need to take, and we have fewer resources than we did 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the national meeting, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Education, used to fly teams of people from each campus to the meeting every year. They'd pay for your travel, they'd pay for your hotel. There was no registration. They'd give you materials. And then they would send out these grant announcements that would fund 100, 200 campuses around the country with a fairly good chunk of change back then, first under the FIPSI grant contest and later under the Safe and Drug-Free Schools grant contests, up to $250,000 to do programming on your campus. Slowly that eroded. There used to be a thing called the network. Is anyone out there familiar or remember the network? Okay. The network was funded the same time. They put money into that, and it networked campuses around the country to disseminate things. They funded the Higher Ed Center, and slowly but surely they cut and cut and cut and cut till right now there's really nothing left at the federal level in the way of support for this issue. So we have a few other challenges right now, and I think these are also opportunities, all right? And the big one that I see on the horizon is the use of technology in supporting recovery and in primary prevention. Now, what's interesting here is that, like everything else on the internet, this is kind of the Wild West. We have, if you go on to iTunes and put in drinking apps or alcohol apps, about 2/3 of them are going to teach people how to drink better, and a third of them are going to have some kind of preventive thing in it. One of the interesting ones is if you do a drunk driving prevention thing, there's a few that are BAC calculators, and they'll kind of tell you shouldn't drink and drive at this level or this many drinks. There's other ones that basically use information available on the internet to help you avoid DUI checkpoints and enforcement. So people are very creative in trying to put these things out. Increasingly, there are researchers trying to work on developing smartphone technologies to prevent alcohol and drug related problems at the event level. So if we go back to that slide that I had up with 100,800,000 drunken events in the US every year among college students, think about an app that could dampen that, even by 10%. It would have a giant effect. And the nice thing about these is once they're developed, they're relatively cheap to disseminate, if not free, and they have wide reach among our students. This is what our students use. They use smartphones, right? That's the old way of doing things is changing. The other thing that we have to think about is the way higher education is being delivered is now in flux, all right? And this is an important thing, and it's one that I haven't heard anyone talk about in our field yet. But if you think about online education, if you think about universities trying to have satellites all over the country, the folks in this room are going to have a bigger challenge down the road, right? We're going to have students all over the place. We're going to have dispersed problems. And we're not going to necessarily have central locations where students can come. So this is going to be a challenge for us to think about. And so we have to kind of watch the trends in higher education as we try to move forward to solve this issue. We already heard about marijuana, but it's worth saying again. This is, if we look at alcohol and drug use from an epidemiological standpoint on college campuses, we've long known alcohol is the most used drug. Past year use is anywhere between 86 and 89% consistently. We have 40% of all college students reporting being drunk in the last month, and I could go on and on. Marijuana, though, had been historically pretty level, with about 30% of students reporting using marijuana once in the last year, and of that group, you'd find about half were regular marijuana users. Those numbers are going up, as we saw the other day. And as the norms around marijuana change and marijuana legalization increases, we're going to be challenged with what to do about the marijuana issue. I think one of the slides that was most interesting yesterday, and one that we really need to maybe a place to start for us, is the combined use of marijuana with heavy alcohol use. So at the same event, people drinking and using marijuana. The risk, as the slide showed yesterday, is exponential for that. All right, so the types of problems that happen will be much more serious. Now, there is some research out there that shows that most students who use marijuana, and this is a little bit dated, and this is a study we did in our shop in San Diego, but most students that use marijuana are also heavy episodic drinkers, okay? So the two go together. And so it will be very likely that we will see more and more of these kinds of dual poly-drug use at the event level intoxication that's going to cause us problems. So if we want to know where to start with marijuana and we don't want to wait for the science to catch up with the real world, that's a good place to start. Driving, I would concur with yesterday's speakers, that second place to start. Okay, so what do we need to do? And I think that you know, my goal is not to end this conference on a downer, because I think we have an opportunity here. And I think part of it is really we need to tell our story better. There's a lot going for us right now. And there's a lot of things that we haven't done well as a field tying ourselves to that I think will help get policymakers, business leaders, and college administrators interested in this issue again. I think part of our problem is basically what we'd call issue fatigue, right? We've been working at this for a while, and we have some successes, and then we have some failures, and then as Peter Lake said, the new flavor of the week comes in, right? A new issue emerges, and funding shifts to that. And universities are highly complex, and they have a lot of things that they have to respond to, including trends in higher education and Title IX and shifting policy landscape. So we have a lot of things we have to compete with. And then if you think about what I I talked about with the Cecil illustration, we're also competing against all kinds of things in the media and for attention for our issue. And there are tons of worthy issues out there, but we have to do a better job at positioning ourselves in a way that people want to invest in the solutions to the kinds of problems that we're trying to prevent and support the recovery communities to help have healthy and safe campus environments. So, what can we do? And I think this is kind of the thing that in the next couple months the higher education center is really going to try to help everyone work on. We're going to build a page that lays out some arguments that you can use for different audiences, the media, campus administrators, parents, students, the lay public, business, for telling our story better. So this is media advocacy things. We're going to put support materials up on how to get your story placed in the internet, how to deal with the media, which is not an easy thing, that takes on a life of its own often. But we're going to start providing supports in those areas for you all to help advocate for the issue in general and for more funds on your individual campuses and get this back on the radar. So let's come back to the Cecil thing. 1 week. In 1 week, we're already starting to see policy changes from this. Delta Airlines will not ship trophies, big game trophies, back from Africa anymore. We have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reevaluating their policy. My point with all this is it doesn't take much for our issue to tip and get back on the radar. We just need to make a concerted effort. We need to tell our story better. And our goal really here is to help support that effort any way we can. And I hope you think that's a useful thing, but it's one of those things that gets very frustrating to be out here and go to Washington and talk to people at the Department of Education, at SAMHSA, at NIAAA and NIDA, and everyone kind of shrugs and says, yeah, it's an important problem, but you know, there's just no money, there's no political will to do this. That's not acceptable. And I think we need to really try to become advocates for ourselves again. We were better at it a while ago, and it's tiring. We all got a lot on our plate. We're all doing way too much. But you know, my goal is to move the field forward and have the higher ed center support all of your work. And I don't think we'd be doing that unless we helped you get the resources you actually need to do what you need to do on your campuses. So with that, I'm just going to kind of close with, you know, look for the new web resources in the next month or so. They're going to be up there. We want your feedback. We want your help developing it. We view this as a two-way street. We have some expertise, but you all are the real experts as well. So you need to tell us, you know, this worked on my campus and this didn't, and we're going to share those stories. We want to get that out so we can all learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm going to call up our closing speaker. We got Dr. Mike Boehm, who is the Associate Provost at The Ohio State University, and he's going to make a few closing remarks, and then we'll let you get back to your lunch and your dessert. And the last thing I'd like to say is thanks once again for coming. It's been an amazing meeting, and we look forward to seeing you all here next year. So thank you.